A bombshell report has come out about the NFL and potential collusion dating back to Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson, and a lot more. And there are plenty of Lamar Jackson details in there. We talk about that. Diontae Johnson opening up again on his Ravens stint and so much more coming up on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much for being here today on this Wednesday, making Locked On Ravens a part of your day and your first listen each and every single day. Free and available on all podcasting platforms. So in video form on YouTube, you can like and subscribe to the channel. In audio form, you can follow along and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And thanks so much to all the everydayers, the first-time listeners. If you're somewhere in the middle, thanks to you as well. Here with me today to break down, this is a jam-packed episode we have. It is Nikhil Mehta of Russell Street Report. Nikhil, hopefully the summer's treating you well so far. I know it is hot outside, as we talked about before the show began, but this Ravens team, I think they've had a pretty good offseason so far. Have you thought it's gone?
I mean, I think the Ravens kind of do the same thing they do every year, which is fill a couple needs in free agency, add a lot of really good value in free agency in the draft, and then go through their spring practices, see where their roster is, and then make a splash veteran addition that we saw last week in Jaire Alexander. So in a way, it's all going kind of according directly to plan. I think for the second off season in a row, essentially, which, you know, after all of the tumultuous Lamar Jackson extension years, which I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. It does seem like the team just things are a little bit calmer in terms of what the short and long-term future of the team look like. You can kind of expect the same thing every offseason.
And I know dating back to that Lamar contract negotiation, you're right, where the future of the team was uncertain. Lamar requested the trade, and I wanted to move forward. I wanted to forget all about it, but that's not what we're doing, because we're going back in time, because there was a bombshell report that dropped the NFL, a collusion case. And I know, Nikhil, you read over it, and I have as well. There is a lot in this. So essentially, the NFL and NFLPA managed to conceal a ruling in a collusion case for more than 5 months. And Pablo Torre, who has a series of his own about Pablo Finds Out, he broke this all down. It's a 60-plus page report. And essentially, this says that there was evidence of collusion. And in a way, there was the NFL trying to collude to discourage fully guaranteed contracts. There was a section about Lamar Jackson and his negotiations during the 2022-2023 period, essentially, where there was a text message to Eric DeCosta that was revealed where Lamar said, quote, "I'm going to continue to request a fully guaranteed contract. I understand you all don't, and that's fine." There was also a claim in there that Lamar said his microphone wasn't working on his phone, which would make communication with Eric DeCosta difficult. Also stuff in there about teams not reaching out to Lamar not giving the Ravens a list of teams. So all this stuff, Nikhil, is just giving me flashbacks to that season and that offseason and how tumultuous it was. I mean, what were your overall takeaways, not just from the Lamar Jackson section of it, but, you know, a pretty big claim here that there was encouragement of collusion to stop these fully guaranteed contracts after the Deshaun Watson deal with Cleveland?
Yeah, so a couple things. I think one, you mentioned earlier that, you know, the NFL and the NFLPA, you know, didn't want this released. They kept it from being publicly released for a while because neither of them really won. Right. The NFLPA was able to prove that there was some collusive behavior between, you know, the NFL teams in terms of fully guaranteed contracts for quarterbacks, but they couldn't prove that there was like enough collusive behavior that actually resulted in damages to those players is kind of the bird's eye view of why they don't want to release, because neither side won. The NFLPA proved the teams did something wrong, but that it wasn't bad enough that actually caused damages to the players. And of course, the NFL looks bad because, you know, the clubs are operating like a little cabal. And so that's kind of the main takeaway I have from it, is that neither side really won. I think the main thing is for the Ravens, two things. One, it's a lot of stuff that we already knew. We kind of already knew Lamar Jackson wanted a fully guaranteed contract and that the Ravens, you know, were not willing to do that. and that, they were very determined to make the Watson deal an outlier. And that was kind of the attitude of the whole league, is that they all wanted the Watson deal to be an outlier. The other thing that we knew is that Lamar really didn't ever want to leave Baltimore. I think that's very much evident when he submits a trade request, but refuses to say, where he might want to go. I think, again, it was just a tactic, and I think everyone was on edge at the time. But knowing the Ravens had their franchise tag and the ability to match, I think a team may have had to come in with a fully guaranteed contract in order to entice Lamar to sign an offer sheet, and no one was going to do that. So I think there is like some humor in, Jackson having phone issues, and there was, just the whole idea that he is negotiating this on his own. Versus these other guys in those, when Russell Wilson, Kyler Murray reference, it's all referencing their agent. So I think that was another really interesting angle, is that Lamar is kind of navigating all of this alone. And that leads to not just communication issues, but kind of the whims of the player. Because I think the thing that I thought was really interesting is that DeCosta was surprised that he accepted that draft eve offer that he ultimately signed. That was something that was included in that report. So, like I said, a lot of things that we already kind of hinted at, that we suspected, but it is interesting to see kind of the confirmation, and that, the NFLPA could prove that there was communication between these owners and there was a real desire. And I think we already knew there was a real desire of teams to make the Watson contract an outlier, but that the NFLPA was kind of able to piece it together and present that. What's interesting is I don't know what really impact it has on the future. That seems like that fully guaranteed contract battle was lost for teams or for players. So,
yeah, and I think the big thing with Lamar's deal, which ended up being 5 years, 260 with 135 guaranteed at signing, goes up to obviously 185 in total guaranteed money. That deal is now the 10th highest deal in terms of average annual value in the league right now. Lamar and Nikhil, we know the extension that could be coming down the pipeline at some point becomes the biggest conversation with this. And you mentioned the future, how you think it, may or may not impact it. What do you see with the Ravens and Lamar this time around? Because again, it's going to be some of the same conversations. There is still time. It's not like this whole contract thing, and they were up against the clock. They had to do the whole franchise tag thing to keep him there. There was all this conversation. Oh, the Ravens, if a team wants to negotiate with him, the Ravens, they're going to do all the hard work, and the Ravens will just match it. And so that was one of the reasons why, maybe teams didn't reach out this way, didn't reach out that way. But I think this report, you're right. I think a lot of this was kind of already assumed, already known, but it gives more context to it. How do you think that the negotiations this time, maybe with this report holding any sort of weight, could go?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much weight the report holds. It's clear the relationship between Jackson and the Ravens is still very solid. They signed his best friend. They signed DeAndre Hopkins this offseason. They've been very committed. And it seems like he has a little more input in some roster decisions. And so that is certainly evidence that they kind of have a long-term plan together. But in terms of his next deal, I think what this report and really looking back on his last deal tells us is that Jackson was signed for cheap. Like you're saying, his deal quickly dropped to 10th with guys who signed later that offseason. And I think that he is going to recognize that he's signing with 2 years left on his deal. He's going to extend himself, or he's got 3 years left on his deal right now. He's going to extend. You would have to imagine it's at least 3 years on top of that. And he's going to have to ask himself, okay, Dak Prescott's at the top of the market at $60 million. Will I take a 62 and a half, a more symbolic bump above him like he took above Jalen Hurts? Or do I want to say, look, I am the best football player on the planet. I want $65 million a year because I know in the next couple of years, all of these other guys are going to catch up and start to outpace me. And so I think that's probably where, this negotiation is going to come down to, is his ability, one, to kind of fully reset the market instead of just barely outpacing the next guy. And I also think, like we've been talking about all day, it's going to be the guarantees. And Josh Allen really blew that out of the water with $250 million fully guaranteed, $147 million fully guaranteed, $250 million in total guarantees. And the Ravens are going to have to find a way to top that. And I think that's actually going to be the big battleground, is how much of that money is total investing guarantees versus fully guaranteed at signing.
And the big thing is, just like you mentioned in this report, apparently Eric DeCosta offered Lamar Jackson two different 3-year contracts that DaCosta himself considered to be fully guaranteed, but Lamar did not accept either of those and then requested a trade right after that. So I think, Lamar's perspective of what is fully guaranteed versus Eric DaCosta and the Ravens' perspective on what is fully guaranteed and just the intricacies that go within that is going to be a major talking point. I know that, we can't speak in, this exact date, Nikhil Lamar is going to sign this extension, but would you expect something to happen before the season, or is this something that you feel like, because I don't think during the year they're going to negotiate. That was clear last time that this whole thing happened. With that cutoff date in mind, do you feel like it's possible? Because they need to clear up cap space in one way or the other. Lamar would certainly help them, or do you think that this could be a next offseason conversation?
I definitely think it's possible. I think Eric DaCosta is balancing honestly, like maybe a half dozen different extensions right now. And this is the really tough thing is Lamar is probably the most important one, but he's not the most immediate one. There are a lot of guys who may be poised for breakout years that you want to get under contract. There are guys, Linderbaum and Isaiah and Kyle Hamilton, your first round picks, who are nearing the end of their contract. So I think that's why it's hard to predict if Lamar's going to get done this year, because it doesn't have to get done this year. Now, I'd argue that there are a lot. Linderbaum and Hamilton don't even have to get done this year. But the problem with pushing off Lamar Jackson's contract until next year is that he has way more leverage because of that giant cap hit. And so, Eric DaCosta said that, the plan was kind of for Lamar to get another extension around this time. The Ravens know they're going to have to make him the highest paid player in the league. I really think it's going to just come down to, weirdly in a way, that report elucidated to me something that I've seen in Lamar Jackson before, which is not that he makes decisions on a whim, but when the right thing is presented to him, he'll just accept it. And it's not like he is just going to accept any offer that Eric gets him. But I think it's clear that the Ravens will continue to try and give him multiple offers and pull the different levers of the contract structure to find something that works for him. I really just think it depends on how good his phone service is in South Florida.
Could be. Hopefully the microphone is working this time around for Lamar. And to Lamar's credit, now with these negotiations, what he has on his resume that he did not back then is another MVP. Should have been 2, but this, we don't have to have that conversation right now. It's a whole different can of worms, but he had that MVP as well as another historic year. So that will certainly help Lamar. Plus, I think Josh Allen's deal, it's another leverage point for Lamar, Nikhil, kind of like what you talked about there. But coming up in the second part of the show, an old friend has reappeared and resurfaced. Diontae Johnson opened up again for some reason. I don't know why the reason was, but for some reason on his Baltimore Ravens stint, and gave his perspective on what happened. So be sure to stay tuned. A lot coming up on the show. First, this show is brought to you by Rugiet. Guys, you probably heard of Viagra or Cialis. Maybe you've even tried them. But if you're looking for something beyond the usual pill, it's time to meet Rugiet Ready. Rugiet Ready is a next-gen prescription treatment designed to amplify arousal in the brain and boost blood flow. Unlike the usual pills that can take hours, Rugiet's 3-in-1 formula dissolves under your tongue and kicks in fast on average in 15 minutes. Effects can last 36 hours, so you can stay confident and in control when the moment is right. You can even read customer reviews on their site. That's helping a lot of people feel more confident and present in the moment. Head to Rugiet.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL to get 15% off today. That's RUGIET.com/LockedOn and use promo code LockedOnNFL for 15% off. Individual results may vary with prescription treatment. Compounded drugs are permitted to be prescribed under federal law, but are not FDA approved and do not undergo FDA safety, effectiveness, and manufacturing review. Please visit the Rugiet website for full safety information. Back here on Locked On Ravens, Kevin Oestreicher, Nikhil Mehta still talking Baltimore Ravens football. We talked about the crazy report that dropped on Tuesday. A lot of information in there, some which was new, a lot of it which was assumed or already known. We know, Nikhil, though, that for Diontae Johnson, his Ravens tenure was not good, was not what anybody hoped it would be. The Ravens acquired him for pretty cheap, right? Really, they didn't lose anything in the deal, but it was just a bad situation all around. Diontae refusing to play in games. He got suspended by the team, ended up getting released. Houston, same sort of thing happened, and then he somehow ends up back in Baltimore because we know Eric DaCosta, he wants to make sure he can take advantage of every little thing. So although they didn't end up getting a comp pick for him, I think the idea that they could have a lot of people appreciated Acosta making that move. But Diontae, he still is talking about the Ravens. This is something honestly, Nikhil, I kind of forgotten about and moved past, but Diontae still is opening up about his time in Baltimore, this appearing on the Sports and Suits podcast. So if you haven't checked out that interview, highly recommend you do so. He opened up about the controversial moments that ended up leading to a very tumultuous and rocky journey in Baltimore. And he essentially said that he checked out mentally in Baltimore. It wasn't for him. He said he loved the players, loved the organization, but he talked about that game in Philadelphia where he refused to go in the game. He said, quote, "I wasn't getting into any run plays, no passing plays or nothing. It was cold. End of the third, going into the fourth, they were like, Tay, we need you." I was like, nah, I don't think it's a good idea for me. Like, my legs are already ice cold. And I didn't want to go out there and put bad stuff on film. It's not like I didn't want to go in the game. But leading up to this point, I had been through so much. I told them I'm not going to go in. So I just sat on the bench. And that's when they suspended me. Now, mind you, Nikhil, it was 41 degrees in Baltimore that day when the Ravens played the Eagles at M&T Bank Stadium. Not necessarily the warmest ever, but we're not talking sub-30 temperatures here for Diontae. I mean, look, he says he wants to go in the game. He doesn't want to go in the game because it's cold out. He doesn't want to put bad stuff on film. Honestly, I've already said a lot about this situation. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it because to me, it might have put him in a bad spot in that moment, but, to me, it's fighting for your team. And this, to me, was giving up on them in a moment when they needed him. He tried to provide more details on it, but, to me, this doesn't really do anything in terms of how I look back on Diontae Johnson's tenure.
Yeah, a couple of things about Diontae, right? He's a volume receiver. That has been, how he was able to rack up 1,000 yards a couple years ago with the Steelers. It's how he was able to average. I think he was averaging like 51 yards a game with the Panthers before the trade deadline last year because he was a number 2 receiving weapon on an offense that really didn't have many receiving weapons behind him. So he's getting funneled all of these touches, and he comes to Baltimore, and he is way down the depth chart. He's learning a new offense. He doesn't have the run blocking kind of grit that Tylan Wallace has. And he's not like ready to come in the game. In like the teams have heat, they have heat, they have warmers, they have bikes on the sidelines. I mean, if him not coming in the game is, to me, more of a measure of, well, if I'm not going to start and you're not going to get me out there, then I'm not going to, care. I'm not going to be ready to come in the game. And I think, something you mentioned earlier is like, what's compelling you to say this? I think, it doesn't look good. I understand from a, okay, I don't want to hurt myself. I don't want to come in and, put bad stuff on tape, but then you're just putting nothing on tape and looking like a bad teammate. And those things, as they did get out and teams find out about it. So, if I were him, I would focus on just trying to get targets in Cleveland and putting, last year behind him, because he has proven that when he can get a lot of targets, he can make some plays. I don't think that ever makes him, really effective receiver for the rest of his career, but he can bounce around from some teams that just have thinner receiving cores and soak up some wide receiver 2-3 targets for them. And be fine. I just don't understand the impetus behind rehashing what was just a obviously bad situation.
Diontae's going back in the past, Nikhil. Let's talk about the actual present of this team in terms of the wide receivers on the roster. Now, you were at OTAs, you were at minicamp, you were at the facility. You were able to be boots on the ground in terms of seeing these guys firsthand and how they performed. We know Rashod Bateman got the big extension. He's opened up on the lounge and other outlets about his journey and his extension and how much it means to him. Zay Flowers looking for another big year coming off of 2 really good ones. You mentioned D-Hop earlier. They added him. And then you have guys who I think we heard a lot about. What's your opinion on the Ravens wide receiver group as a whole right now? And what do you see from those guys?
Yeah, so let's go right down the depth chart and go with the 3 starters. Monken has talked about Flowers, Hopkins, and Bateman as his 3 starters. That's, I think, a sneaky one of the better groups in the NFL that you're not going to hear talked about as much because they're not the, 1,800, 2,000 yard kind of guys like Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson's, but it's a really well-rounded group. It's a group that's comfortable, lining up in different alignments, doing different things. Hopkins primarily outside, and that's going to get Flowers and Bateman some more reps in the slot. I think especially a good spot for Bateman. He can be really effective out of the slot, and his presence as a run blocker is something he's really worked on since being in Baltimore. And so that starting group is really just going to soak up snaps. Behind them is Tylan Wallace, who I mentioned earlier, just a grinder of a player. I think the Ravens really like having on the field for run blocking. He's a guy who last year took advantage of every opportunity that he got. And so I think that's something that, he's a player. He's almost like the inverse of Diontae Johnson, where he doesn't need a lot of targets to make an impact. He makes an impact with what he's given. Devontae Walker has been probably the biggest wide receiver to watch coming out of spring practices. Now, this is an important caveat that I'm sure other guests have given before, but these practices have very different rules of engagement. They're padless. They are minimal contact. Depending on the drill, there are sometimes when defensive backs are not allowed to make a play on the ball at all. And so I think that one of the things to note is that it's more about seeing how a receiver is improving and how they've developed from what you saw last season over the offseason. And with Walker, the big thing for him was a more well-rounded route tree. He fell in the draft after his eligibility issue at North Carolina. He wasn't able to play as much, partially because he just didn't put as much of a diverse route tree on film. North Carolina had him do just a simplified route tree because he wasn't with the team as long. So he is, really working on finding open spots underneath against zone, underneath crossers. And I think that is something that the Ravens really think. They drafted him thinking it's not a matter of what he can't do. It's a matter of what he wasn't asked to do at Carolina. And so he's had a really strong spring. I'll be honest, the other Ravens receivers haven't stood out to me a ton. I think that you see a number of guys like I think Anthony Miller, guys who were on the roster last year. Anthony Miller is kind of just a consistent presence. Dayton Wade and Malik Cunningham have not been as exciting. LeJontay Wester is a big one who we did not see much out of him in the passing game in OTAs and spring practices. And so that's one where he's pretty clearly going to have to win a punt returning job for him to make the roster. He's a 7th round pick, so it's no guarantee of a roster spot. And I think he's really going to need to carve out a punt returning role in order to win the roster. So I think with the Ravens receiver room, you see it's a very clear starting trio. You like the depth that they have in Wallace and Devontae Walker. But behind, nothing really stood out in spring practices.
Yeah, and hopefully, those guys behind won't have to play big roles this year. Every team does go through injuries, and we saw last year the Ravens were put in that spot in the playoffs when Zay Flowers missed both playoff games. And, that final drive, Lamar Jackson was throwing to Anthony Miller and Steven Sims, and he still was able to lead him down the field for a touchdown, which, is impressive in its own right. But I think this year, Nelson Aguilar was great as a wide receiver 3/4 for the Ravens over the last 2 seasons. 2023 was a little better than 2024 was for him, but even still, I think DeAndre is an upgrade if he can stay healthy and find a consistent role there, with Rashod and Zay hopefully taking another step. And, for a guy like a Tylan Wallace or a Tez Walker, if they're able to make spot plays here and there. But I think with the versatility, Nikhil, this offense can bring to the table with heavy sets, obviously they're going to run the ball a lot. This ball, there's only one ball, and there are a lot of quality pass catchers on this Ravens team. So I'm curious to see how the target snaps and all that are split up. But coming up, Ravens offensive line, secondary, and a lot more minicamp and OTA takeaways from Nikhil. Stay tuned. Plenty to come on the show. First, the show is brought to you by Monarch Money. Ever wish managing your money felt easier? With Monarch Money, it can. Whether you're growing your savings or planning a big purchase, Monarch puts you in the driver's seat. It's like having your own personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Now, Monarch Money is more than a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So in addition to managing your money, you're also building wealth. And for me, I do take out a decent amount, and that category for me, I didn't realize how much I was spending on it, but Monarch helps me budget, plan, and save, and it's really done a lot in terms of helping me identify where I need to cut costs and where I actually have more wiggle room than I thought I did. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com, 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. Again, that's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. Back on Locked On Ravens, Kevin Oestreicher, Nikhil Mehta, talking Ravens football with you here on this Wednesday edition of the show. Nikhil, we talked about the wide receivers. We talked about how there's only one ball to go around, but with Lamar Jackson, you got to protect him in order for him to have a shot to go out there and get the ball to those receivers consistently. We know Lamar can make magic out of nothing. He is the best in the league at doing that. But we know Lamar can operate from a clean pocket with the best of them. So I'm curious to hear about your offensive line takeaways from spring practices, OTAs, minicamp, because I think that we know about Linderbaum, we know about Rosengarten, we know about Stanley, but how do those guard spots look right now? Because that's the biggest point of conversation.
Yeah, so, the Ravens, I think John Harbaugh said at the press conference, he's pretty much expecting Daniel Falele to return and start at right guard. And Andrew Voorhees is kind of the front runner for the left guard spot. He won that job out of training camp last year as well. George Warhop said that Ben Cleveland is probably going to be the primary competition for Andrew Voorhees. It's not really clear who the competition for Daniel Falele is. I think it's pretty clear that the team plans to start him at right guard. It would probably take an injury for him to get knocked out of that spot, just because there's no clear player on the roster to take over instead of him. You could argue that Cleveland has always been better on the right side than he has on the left. But if he wasn't factoring into the competition last year, I'd be just so shocked if he was this year. So it seems very clear that that's going to be Falele. And that leaves left guard as the main battle. And again, Voorhees is a guy who we all know the story, ACL tear at the combine after being a projected maybe day 2 pick. The Ravens trade back into the draft to get him. And the hope was really that last year he would take over as the starting left guard. And he didn't get the job back after he got injured. And I will say at his press conference, he said, he called it an interesting situation. I think he was kind of nodding at the fact that usually when you win a job out of training camp, if you get injured, you get your job back when you're healthy. And that did not happen with Andrew Voorhees. It was a little more complicated because Patrick McCary started the season at right tackle, was rotating with Rosengarten, and then the Ravens felt comfortable to move forward with Rosengarten at right tackle once Voorhees got injured because they flipped McCary to left guard. Anyway, all of that is to say, Voorhees didn't get a starting job back, and he's pretty determined to hold on to it this year. And so I think that that's probably going to be your starting 5. I think it's more interesting to look down the roster and, look at Cleveland, Nick Samac, Garrett Dellinger, even a guy like Darian Dalcourt, who's an undrafted free agent, who has been getting a lot of playing time during spring practices. It's going to be a battle for those backup interior spots. I think it's going to be the real battle in training camp, less than it is battle for the starting left guard spot. And one thing I want to know on Roger Rosengarten, he is so much more confident this year, night and day from last year, very clearly feels comfortable in the NFL. I think we asked him about that Myles Garrett exchange where he said, I'm a nobody. And he said that's probably the wrong word to use. He should have said rookie. But he really said that was a big moment for him in terms of realizing, no, I belong here. And you can see that he is now very vocal and not just vocal and trying to be a leader, but really being himself. And his personality is coming out, which is just a really enjoyable thing to watch.
It feels like you mentioned, Nikhil, the offensive line might be a bit more set at the guard spots than, people might be thinking it is right now. But there are a lot of roster spots up for grabs, but at the same time, there really aren't that many. Especially when it comes to set vets, we're going to make the team and positional battles here and there. Like you said, I just think that's a mentality roster-wise, where it's not like there's a starting spot up for grabs, but that second, third, fourth string, that's where the real battle lies. And I think part of that also, you talk about the secondary now, where there are just names on names on names in that secondary. Obviously, Jaire Alexander being the most recent one that everybody is excited about. But we know he wasn't participating on Wednesday at minicamp. He was just sitting on the sideline. He was chopping it up with some of his new teammates. But Ravens take Malaki Starks in the draft this past year. They add a couple of rookie corners as well. Jalen Armour Davis has been getting some looks at safety, and just a lot of interesting ways that Zach Orr can utilize the secondary. Who stood out to you in that regard, and how do you think it shapes up heading into 2025?
Yeah, so the Ravens signed Jaire Alexander, and he obviously going to come in and be a starter. There's no way he came in to sign here to compete for a starting job, right? So the starting 5 is him and Nate Wiggins on the outside, Marlon Humphrey in the slot, Malaki Starks and Kyle Hamilton as safety. And like you just said, that's kind of set. The really interesting battles are for the backup spots. for, the third safety role in dime, for a backup slot job, just to make the roster in a really, really loaded secondary. TJ Tampa, I think, is a guy who has been talked about a lot this offseason. And he had a pretty strong spring, I would say, given the lack of aggressiveness that cornerbacks are allowed to have. Tampa, had a pretty strong spring, made a number of good plays on the ball, which is especially hard when you're not allowed to really hit the receiver and make that much contact with the receiver, right? So he is kind of a loser, if you want to term it that way, from this Jaire Alexander signing, because with Chidobe Awuzie, it's possible, I think, that Tampa was competing with Awuzie for the starting job opposite Wiggins. But even if he lost it, could have very much seen him taking that job over during the regular season. Now it just seems like it's very hard for him to get on the field, barring an injury, because it just seems unlikely that he'll be able to beat out Jaire Alexander or just work his way on the field as a guy who plays outside only. Now, when the Ravens go into dime, this is going to be, to me, the really interesting thing about what Zach Orr's thinking about this defense this year. When he goes into dime, is he going to bring in a third safety, which right now is looking like Sanusi Kane, who did have a very strong spring. He's a guy who I looked at more as a special teams, run the alley kind of guy, but he was very active in pass coverage during spring practices. So do you bring in him? Do you bring in a guy who can line up at the slot, safety, or outside in Jalen Armour-Davis, which is something he's been doing in spring practices? Do you bring in TJ Tampa and just figure out matchups and try and get your best players on the field? Same thing with Awuzie. So he has a lot of options. And you could still argue that the defense needs kind of a third safety that has a little bit more of a veteran cover mindset, although it's worth noting those guys haven't always worked out the greatest for the Ravens over the last couple of years. And that they have done a really good job developing day three safeties as well. And so it wouldn't surprise me if Kane has done enough in spring practices to kind of give himself the pole position on that third safety dime role, especially if he is able to play comfortably in a split safety look with Starks. And that would allow Kyle Hamilton to really get unleashed down near the line of scrimmage, which is something the Ravens were hoping would happen by pairing Starks with Darius Washington.
The Ravens are not a team that just plays base the whole time, and that's all they do. Like, they very much like to play heavy DB packages. The starting five, like you mentioned, they are going to play. You could put big nickel. Kyle Hamilton can come down and play the slot. Like, there are so many. I mean, Marlon Humphrey said endless possibilities, and it truly feels that way now that you've added a guy like a Jaire Alexander. But Nikhil, we've talked about some specific positional groups. I'm curious if there was anybody else in particular across the entire roster that maybe stood out to you in a good way, or maybe didn't stand out enough and you thought maybe you were expecting a little bit more from them. Who are some other, I guess, studs and duds that you'd have from minicamp?
Yeah, so one stud, and I'm sure you've heard him today before, is Ruben Lowry, an undrafted rookie cornerback out of Chattanooga. He has been really impressive, just making a ton of plays on the ball. And that was something I noticed in OTAs. And then there was a play in minicamp where he collapsed. I think it was a play action and then a pass into the flat, something along those lines. And he collapsed on it. And Chuck Pagano got really excited about Ruben Lowry's play on that because he was like all over his assignments. He came in and obviously didn't make a physical tackle or anything like that because he wasn't allowed to. But you could tell Pagano was really excited about this guy. And so, he's probably the one guy that I think is worth mentioning just because of the amount of times I noticed him. It's hard, like we talked about, to even make the roster in the secondary room. But he's going to be a guy who's going to try and make an argument. Like I mentioned, LaJohntay Wester didn't really stand out. The rookie out of Colorado didn't really stand out as a pass catcher. Dayton Wade also, there was a lot of hype around him last year during spring practice and training camp. Did not see it quite as much this year. I think that size and playing through contact has been an issue. He had a couple plays where the ball either went off his hands or was taken away from him for an interception. And so, the other thing is the backup quarterback situation with Cooper Rush and Devin Leary. Obviously, Leary's still pretty inaccurate. And Rush is still learning the offense. I think there's very clearly with Rush and a willingness to push the ball downfield that Josh Johnson did not have. And I think the Ravens appreciate that in a backup who's not just going to take care of the ball, but he is going to try and make some plays instead of just avoiding mistakes.
Yeah, and I think for the Ravens, them investing that money into Cooper Rush, they clearly had a plan in mind there. They've, the Tyler Huntleys of the world, the Josh Johnsons of the world, like you mentioned, clearly an investment was made at that position. Ideally, Cooper Rush's role is he never has to play unless it's a blowout and the Ravens are winning. But Nikhil, I appreciate you hopping on. Thanks so much for joining. Please, on the way out, tell people where they can find you and what you're working on as the offseason chugs along here.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, X at Nick Knows Ball. And you can find my work on Russell Street Report. I'm going to be looking at a number of potential contract extensions, doing some player profiles, rookie profiles for both our rookies, and also looking around the AFC North and what to expect from some of our new rivals players. So expect that over the next month, and then I'll be back at training camp in July.
Nikhil knows his stuff. Be sure to give him a read on Russell Street Report and support his work. All the links to his work will be down in the description below. Nikhil, appreciate you as always. And to everybody who watched or listened today to Locked On Ravens, thank you for supporting the show here on the way out. Be sure to hit the like and subscribe button in video form and follow along in audio form for 5 days a week of daily Ravens coverage. And I'll see you right back here tomorrow talking more Ravens football on Locked On Ravens.